Well, this is a tribute to my friend and mentor, Mr. Zig Ziglar. I met Zig in 1976, which is 40 years ago. We met down in Cincinnati, and after he spoke, I went back to the book table and we talked. And I told him I was using his materials. I taught dentists how to do, how to get along better with their staff and how to better understand patients. And so he asked me if I'd send him the outline, which I did. Then in 1977, Zig was going to come to Columbus. So I called him up and I said, talked to his secretary, Lori, and I said, Lori, could I talk with Mr. Ziglar? She says, well, yeah, what's this about? I said, well, he's coming to Columbus. I'd like to just have lunch with him. She said, well, let me put him on. So she did, and he got on the phone, and we talked for a few minutes, and I relayed that I'd met him the year before down in Cincinnati. And so finally I said, do you ever eat lunch? Well, there's silence on the phone, and he says, well, matter of fact, I do. Why do you ask? I said, well, you're coming to Columbus. I'd like to pick you up at the airport, and let's go to lunch. He said, well, let me look and see. He came back, and he said, nobody's picking me up. I said, well, I'm picking you up. He said, well, how do I know what you look like? I said, you don't need to know what I look like. I know what you look like. So I picked him up at the airport. We went back to the hotel, and he put his things down. At 11:30, we started our lunch, and at 4:30 that afternoon we finished it. And we did know some people in common, but the big thing, both of us came to know Jesus Christ in 1972. I was the week before Easter, 1972. Zig was July the 4th, 1972. Well, in 1979, we went to a seminar Zig had called Born to Win. And in there, they have a segment on I Can to teach children that they can do things and have positive in their life. My son took a can and put a piece of paper on it that says I can, and then no negative. Well, anytime he was captain of the soccer team, and anytime the kids said anything negative, they had to put a quarter in the can. Well, it got so that that can was so heavy that kids realized, you know what, I got to quit saying negative. So I just appreciated so much his willingness to invest in Wanda and I, and so we would meet frequently, and Zig knew that I'd had a partner that had committed suicide, and that was a big impact in my life, and I vowed on his grave I would never ever walk away from a dentist or his family that had problems. And so Zig encouraged me to start a group, which I did. It's called Dentists Helping Dentists, and once or twice a year we have a group that gets together and goes over to Seneca Lake, and we discuss conflicts, areas that we want to learn, not only with our wives and our children, but our patients as well. Zig invited me to be part of the Ziglar Invitational golf tournament. And we usually would go to New Mexico or Texas someplace, because he had to get back for his Sunday school class. And so we would usually get there on a Wednesday afternoon. We'd play 9 to 18 holes, and we would have dinner, and Zig would talk about using God in business. And we tried to get half that were believers and half that were non-believers. Consequently, the next day on Thursday morning, I had the devotions and I did the bridge. So people certainly came to know Christ. They knew exactly what it was all about. That night then Zig would continue with his talk, God in Business. And I don't think he and I ever were together that we didn't lead somebody to Christ. We'd be having breakfast or lunch, and his voice was so distinct. And somebody come over and say, "Are you Zig Ziglar?" He said, "I was when I got up this morning." He said, "Have you met my friend Duke Heller?" And he said, "Well, no." "Listen, let me ask you a question. Where do you worship? And so they'd either say at such a church or I don't. And he said, sit down, my friend's got to tell you something. Well, I would then pull out the brochure and share Christ with them. And many of them came to know Christ through that. I remember after we started the dentist, helping dentists, that I was convinced in my own heart that God wanted me and wanted to have a ministry to dentists and their wives. And so I put together a whole curriculum that we would have a 2-day seminar, we would have round tables. And I remember going to a man I love so much in Pastor Jim Custer, my head pastor. I showed him the material. He said, Duke, this is good stuff, man. This is stuff on forgiveness and how you can serve your family. And then John Willett, who was another pastor who I dedicated my book to, Wanda and I went down and saw he and his wife. And then Wanda and I sat down and said, okay, let's call Zig and Jean. So we did, and we went down, and we just had a delightful lunch together, and then we went back to his house. And so Ziggy says, okay, Duke, let me see this stuff. And so I showed him the curriculum and how we were going to think about buying a farm and putting some cabins on it so that we could have seminars for dentists and their wives that perhaps were struggling. So he looked over at Wanda and he said, Wanda, why is it you want to do this ministry? She said, oh, I don't want to do this ministry. I'm just doing it because Duke wants to do it. Ziggy took that book, closed it up, said, that's it, this discussion's over. You're not doing that ministry. Now, I'd spent hours with counselors talking to him, right? He said, Duke, if God wanted you to be in ministry, doing this project, your wife would be fully on board. Obviously, it isn't her passion. You're not doing that. I said, yes, sir, and I never talked about it again. You know, Ziggy encouraged me almost for 7 years to write a book on how I share Christ with people. And the brochure, he helped me design that together with the elders at the church. And it was of such an interest that I kept putting it off. And finally he called and he left a message with Marcy. And he says, you tell Dr. Heller, I want the first chapter on my desk in 30 days. I don't want him to call me back. I just want it. Well, I actually then wrote the first chapter, sent it to him. He called back up and he said, you tell him the second chapter is due in 2 weeks. Well, that's how I got this book written. And it's how to start a kingdom conversation. The main emphasis being to share Jesus Christ with your blood relatives. I remember once we were having lunch and I said to the waitress who had just served us so well, I said, oh, you've done such a nice job. I said, now you have a nice day. He pointed his finger, he said, don't ever say that again. I said, pardon me? He said, don't ever say have a nice day. I said, why not? He said, you say, make a good day. That way you control circumstances. And if you ever get emails from me, or we leave, I always say, make a good day. I remember him saying that failure is an event, it's not a person. So if a young man has problems with addiction and he's failed everybody, it doesn't have anything to do with how much he loves his mother, his dad, his sister, his brother. And the same thing with dentists, or any profession where they may be depressed. You know, remember that whatever happens, it's just an event. You see, it doesn't have anything to do with how much you and I love our loved ones. So Zig, I want to thank you for investing in my life, brother. I know that my wife and I and our children have been blessed for the things you taught me I was able to utilize in their lives that made them better. I'll see you soon, buddy. Love you.